Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. We love to pick a topic and go deep. And today we're going to talk about Anthony LaRette.
Oh, this is a fascinating one.
Yeah, he's an American serial killer whose crimes went on for like over a decade.
Wow.
Yeah, and we're going to be using his Wikipedia entry as like our roadmap to try to understand his criminal career and the lasting impact of his confessions.
Okay.
It's interesting because he actually confessed to way more murders than he was convicted of.
Really?
And those confessions helped to solve cold cases all across the country.
So these were cases that had gone unsolved for years.
Yeah, like a cold case is just a crime or even an accident that hasn't been fully resolved. They're not like actively investigating it,
Right.
but new information can come up, right?
Yeah, like a witness comes forward, or maybe some old evidence gets re-examined, or, sometimes even the suspect does something that brings it all back up.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, Lorette was born in 1951 and executed in 1995.
Okay.
And get this, he actually used aliases like Mike Watson early on.
Oh, so he was trying to hide his true identity.
Yeah, it's like he wanted to stay hidden, like he was living this double life.
It's almost like he was setting the stage for a life in the shadows. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's start by unpacking the timeline of his confirmed crimes beginning in 1976.
Okay.
His first known murder took place in August 1976 in Marathon, Florida.
Floor.
Yeah, the victim was 26-year-old Jeanette Mickey Wade.
Okay.
And Lorette broke into her home, stabbed her multiple times, and then cut her throat.
Oh, my God.
A witness could describe him,
Wow.
but he got away.
He just vanished.
Yeah, and then just 3 days later, he strikes again, this time in St. Petersburg, Florida.
So he's moving around.
Yeah, he targeted 52-year-old Betty H. Brunton.
That's scary how quickly he struck again. And still in Florida, it seems like he was either moving through the state or maybe choosing victims based on, opportunity.
Yeah, that's a good point. It seems like he was escalating pretty quickly.
Yeah, getting more brazen.
Yeah, in Betty Brunton's case, he stalked her all the way home, entered her house, and stabbed her to death.
Leaving the murder weapon behind.
Yeah, which, kind of shows maybe he was careless or maybe he just felt invincible.
Right.
It's creepy to think that her coworkers, they actually thought she was sick when they found her body.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
could see that, before they realized what really happened.
It's chilling how he was like blending into society, appearing normal while harboring such darkness inside.
Absolutely. A true wolf in sheep's clothing.
His crimes weren't confined to Florida, though. In December 1977, he pops up in Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh, wow. He's on the move.
He murdered 24-year-old Beverly Wortman.
Another young woman.
Yeah, this time he stalked her back to her apartment, entered and stabbed her 19 times before slashing her throat.
19 times. That's just brutal. It seems like the violence itself was the point. Not just a means to an end.
It is unsettling, isn't it? And to make matters worse, a completely innocent bystander was initially arrested for her murder.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine the horror of being wrongly accused like that?
It just shows the chaos and fear that he was creating, right?
Yeah, and it reminds us how eyewitness accounts can be unreliable and how crucial a thorough investigation is.
Absolutely. We can't forget that miscarriages of justice like that have such high stakes.
Exactly.
Okay, so then in May 1978, Lorette is back in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Back to Florida.
Yeah, and 60-year-old Helen Alderson Hall is found murdered in her home.
Interesting.
Her family was actually known for their involvement in greyhound racing, so it makes you wonder if there's a connection there.
Yeah, you have to think about that. Did he target her because of her family's business? Or was it just a coincidence? And the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, that's strange too.
Right. Did she know her attacker?
Did he trick her somehow to get inside?
These are all great questions.
We may never know the answers.
And then the trail takes us to Manhattan, Kansas in November 1978, where 26-year-old Tracy Gladys Miller was found murdered in her home by a coworker.
So another young woman.
Yeah, she had been stabbed multiple times, her throat slashed.
It's a horrifying pattern.
And despite a huge investigation, the police hit a dead end.
He was like a ghost just disappearing after each crime.
He was constantly on the move, right? Leaving this trail of tragedy across so many states.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if that was part of his plan, constantly moving to stay ahead of the law, or was it something deeper?
Maybe a restless mind.
Or even tormented one.
It's a fascinating thought. It does seem like his crimes were becoming more frequent and spread out geographically.
The chilling progression.
And finally, in July 1980, Lorette is back in Missouri, this time in St. Charles.
Okay.
And this is where he commits the murder that would eventually lead to his capture and conviction.
The beginning of the end.
The brutal killing of 18-year-old Mary Fleming.
This is the case that changes everything.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment in the story. Mary Fleming had been grocery shopping and was returning to her parents' apartment when LaRette attacked her.
Oh, wow. Just going about her everyday life?
He followed her, waited till she was alone, and then he struck.
So premeditated.
He attempted to rape her before stabbing her twice in the chest and slashing her throat.
It's like a pattern is emerging. But in this case, there's a sense of desperation, too, almost like he lost control.
Right. He flees right away, leaving her alive but severely wounded.
So maybe a change in his MO.
Mary amazingly managed to get to a neighbor's house before collapsing. She was wearing just her bikini top, desperate for help.
Oh, my gosh.
She was rushed to the hospital, but tragically she didn't make it.
What a horrible way to go.
This case really gripped the community, and initially the police were baffled.
I can imagine no clear motive, no connection to the victim.
And no witnesses to the actual attack.
A real mystery.
It shows how a seemingly random act of violence can really stump even experienced investigators.
They're left grasping at straws, hoping for a break in the case.
And that break came from an unexpected source, a friend of LaRette's.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had been visiting this friend in St. Charles, the same area where Mary Fleming lived right around the time of the murder.
Wow. So a seemingly small detail could be the key to the whole thing.
It's a good reminder that even the smallest piece of information can make a big difference in an investigation.
Absolutely.
So the friend's tip led to an arrest warrant, and the hunt for LaRette began.
Okay.
They tracked him back to his home in Topeka, Kansas, but he had already disappeared.
He was always one step ahead.
A nationwide manhunt started, and it all ended in a tense standoff at his sister's house.
He was cornered.
Yeah, and in a desperate attempt to avoid capture, LaRette actually tried to kill himself. He slashed his own neck and wrists.
Wow, a truly desperate act. Do you think it was guilt remorse or just pure survival instinct?
It's a tough question to answer. We can't really know what was going on in his mind at that moment.
True.
But he survived the attempt and was taken into custody. He waived extradition back to Missouri to face trial for Mary Fleming's murder.
So the wheels of justice started turning.
Yeah, and as investigators dug deeper into his past, they found something else. LaRette had a prior conviction for rape in Lawrence, Kansas back in 1974.
Oh, wow. So this wasn't his first violent crime.
It adds another layer to his criminal history, right?
Absolutely. It suggests a pattern of predatory behavior that had been going on for a while.
And maybe even escalating for years.
It also makes you think, did that conviction make it harder for him to find work or travel?
Yeah, could that have contributed to his transient lifestyle and the escalation of his crimes?
It's definitely something to consider.
And remember the unsolved murder of Tracy Miller in Kansas? Well, authorities began looking into a possible connection between LaRette and that case, too.
So the scope of his crimes is expanding.
Things were definitely heating up. But even in custody, LaRette was already plotting his escape.
Wow, this guy never gave up.
He actually tried to break out of jail using a hacksaw.
Where did he even get a hacksaw?
Somehow he got his hands on one. But luckily, another inmate tipped off the guards.
That was a close call.
It shows how cunning and determined he was.
He was a real threat.
LaRette's trial for Mary Fleming's murder was highly anticipated, and the prosecution presented a strong case.
I bet they did.
They showed graphic crime scene photos to really drive home the brutality of the crime.
To paint a clear picture for the jury.
Exactly. And LaRette, on the other hand, he tried to deflect blame.
Of course.
First, he claimed that a hitchhiker had committed the murder.
Trying to shift the blame.
And then he changed his story to say he killed Mary accidentally.
So many lies.
Yeah, trying to minimize his responsibility.
It's a classic tactic, but often it doesn't work.
The jury saw right through it.
Good.
They deliberated for only an hour and found him guilty.
Wow, that's a quick decision.
And recommended the death sentence.
The evidence must have been overwhelming.
It was, but even after being sentenced to death, LaRette was still trying to manipulate the system.
No way.
He conspired with his own father to stage another escape attempt.
He just wouldn't give up.
They were gonna hire people to kill the guards while LaRette was being transported to the hospital for a faked illness.
That's incredible. It's like something out of a movie.
I know, it's wild, right?
It's really disturbing, too. He was willing to put so many lives at risk just to escape.
The plan was thankfully foiled when his father tried to pay a police informant.
So his own father got caught in the web of his lies.
It's amazing how his criminal mind was still working overtime even on death row.
He was a true criminal mastermind.
So with his conviction and death sentence, the appeals process began.
Okay.
LaRette's lawyers, they argued that the murder wasn't premeditated.
Of course they did.
They blamed his actions on emotional and marital problems.
Trying to find any excuse.
The prosecution, of course, argued that his stalking of Mary Fleming clearly showed that the murder was planned.
Which makes sense.
The appeals process always brings up these questions about justice and punishment.
Yeah, like what's the point of punishment? Is it just about punishing the crime, or should we consider the offender's circumstances?
It's a debate that never really ends.
True.
And on top of the appeals process, authorities in Kansas still wanted to try him for Tracy Miller's murder.
Oh, wow.
But that caused a lot of controversy.
I can imagine.
Some people thought it was a waste of time and resources.
Because he was already on death row.
Exactly. They felt like the death penalty was the ultimate punishment, and why bother with more trials?
Right.
Others argued that every victim deserves justice no matter what.
That's a tough one. Both sides have valid points.
It became a political hot potato.
I could see that.
And then, just when you thought the story couldn't get any crazier, LaRette drops a bombshell in 1988 while still on death row.
Okay, what happened?
He confesses to the murders of Jeanette Wade and Beverly Wortman.
Wow, after all these years, he decides to come clean.
It makes you wonder why.
Was it a genuine desire to clear his conscience, or was he looking for attention?
Maybe a bit of both. We might never know for sure.
It's a mystery that's probably going to haunt investigators forever.
But the confessions didn't end there. In fact, LaRette's confessions were about to get even more shocking.
Oh boy, this is getting intense.
But that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
I can't wait.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into the life and crimes of Anthony LaRette. Before we get into the final chapter of his story, let's recap a bit, where we left off.
Okay, goes good.
So LaRette was on death row, convicted for the murder of Mary Fleming, and he had just confessed to 2 more murders, Jeanette Wade and Beverly Wortman.
Yeah, and what makes those confessions so interesting is the detail he gave. I mean, he didn't just say he did it. He actually described specific things that only the killer would know.
Right, like what kind of details?
He remembered things about the weapons he used, where it happened, even like small details about the victims or their homes.
Wow, it's like he was reliving those moments, taking the investigators step by step through his crimes.
Exactly.
But why, after all those years of silence, why would he suddenly want to reveal all these gruesome details?
That's the question, isn't it? Some people think he was trying to control the narrative, by confessing he was taking ownership of his actions and shaping how his story was told.
Interesting.
Others believe maybe he felt real remorse, a way to try and make amends for what he did.
It's a fascinating psychological puzzle.
It really is.
But the confessions didn't stop there. In fact, on the very day he was scheduled to be executed in 1995, LaRette made one final shocking confession.
What did he say?
He admitted to a total of 31 murders and 10 rapes.
31 murders.
Spanning over a decade and 11 states.
Oh my God, that's unbelievable.
It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies all over the country.
Could you imagine the chaos trying to process all that information?
It must have been overwhelming for those investigators trying to make sense of it all.
They had to figure out what was true and what wasn't, verify details, connect these confessions to unsolved cases. It was a massive undertaking.
Right. And in the middle of all this chaos, there's this one dedicated detective named Patricia Jewell.
I've heard of her. She's amazing.
She'd been interviewing LaRette since 1989. Carefully documenting his confessions, building a rapport with him.
She must have had some incredible skills to be able to connect with someone like him, to earn his trust enough that he would reveal those secrets.
So how did she approach this massive task? Did she have any strategies for figuring out what was real and connecting it to actual cases?
She was a master of detail. She cross-referenced everything LaRette said with unsolved cases across the country. She was looking for any little thing that could connect them.
Like what kind of things?
A specific type of weapon, maybe a unique way of breaking into a house. Even a particular phrase LaRette used to describe a victim.
So she was like piecing together a giant puzzle, looking for those missing pieces.
Exactly. It was a long and difficult process requiring a lot of patience and a sharp eye for patterns.
And did her efforts pay off?
They did. She was able to use LaRette's information to close around 15 cold cases.
Wow, think about the impact of that. For families who had been searching for answers for years, maybe even decades, she brought closure.
She gave them peace, a resolution that they thought they'd never have.
It's a true testament to her dedication and her belief that even the most challenging cases can be solved.
Absolutely, her work was heroic.
And it didn't go unnoticed. She was named Deputy of the Year because of her extraordinary contributions to law enforcement.
She deserved it.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, people can make a real difference.
They can bring hope and justice to those who have been denied it.
Let's take a moment to remember the victims whose lives were taken by Anthony LaRette. We know for sure he murdered Jeanette Wade, Betty Brunton, Beverly Wortman, Helen Hall, Tracy Miller and Mary Fleming.
6 confirmed murders, 6 families forever changed by his cruelty.
But as we've learned, those 6 victims are just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. LaRette's confessions revealed a much wider web of violence.
A horrific trail of murders and assaults across multiple states, countless shattered lives.
He claimed to have committed murders in Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, Texas, and even on a highway between Virginia and Maryland.
It's terrifying to think about the sheer scale of his crimes, the number of lives he impacted.
And it's even more disturbing to think that there might be victims out there whose stories we don't even know, families still waiting for answers.
That's the sad reality of these kinds of cases.
LaRette's confessions provided some closure, but they also opened up a Pandora's box of questions that may never be answered.
He gives some specific details, though, right?
He did, for example, he confessed to assaulting a high school girl in North Little Rock, Arkansas.
Non-fatal, though.
Right, and he also claimed to have committed a murder in Denver, Colorado.
Did he say anything else?
He mentioned 2 or 3 more murders in Florida and an unsolved murder somewhere in Illinois.
Wow, so many lives affected.
And the list goes on. He admitted to at least 8 murders in Kansas, 3 murders in Louisiana, specifically in Morgan City, Houma, and Grand Isle.
It's like he was drifting from state to state, leaving a trail of destruction.
Exactly, and he didn't stop there. He also claimed responsibility for a murder in Kansas City, Missouri, another one in Independence, 2 killings in Biloxi, Mississippi, a murder in Omaha, Nebraska.
It's hard to comprehend how one person could be responsible for so much pain.
And the confessions continued. He also mentioned 2 murders in Texas, one in Dallas and one in Houston, and a final murder on a highway somewhere between Virginia and Maryland.
It's a dark and disturbing chapter in American history, one that leaves us with more questions than answers.
It definitely does. But amidst the horror, there are also lessons to be learned.
Like what?
Well, LaRette's case shows us how important communication and collaboration are between law enforcement agencies across state lines.
That makes sense. He was able to operate undetected for so long because he was moving from state to state.
Exactly. We need better ways to share information, track suspects, and connect the dots between crimes that might seem unrelated.
We also need strong databases and investigative tools that can help us link cases together and bring these criminals to justice.
Imagine if investigators had a national database of unsolved crimes with all the details. They might have been able to catch LaRette sooner and maybe even prevent some of these tragedies.
It's a sobering thought, but it also highlights how far we've come in forensic science and investigative techniques.
Think about DNA analysis. It's revolutionized how we solve crimes. We can link suspects to crime scenes even decades later.
And now we have data analysis and artificial intelligence helping us to find patterns and connections that we might have missed before.
It gives us hope that we're getting better at solving these complex cases and holding people accountable.
But LaRette's case also raises important questions about the criminal justice system itself.
Like, how do we deal with offenders like him who managed to evade capture for so long? How do we balance the rights of the accused with the need to protect society?
And how do we provide support and closure for the families of victims, especially when we might never know the full truth?
These are tough questions, but they're important ones.
Anthony LaRette's reign of terror might have ended with his execution in 1995, but the impact of his crimes continues to this day.
His story reminds us of the darkness that humans are capable of, but it also shows the strength of the human spirit and the pursuit of justice, even in the face of such evil.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of human behavior, there can be glimmers of hope and justice.
And for those left behind, the search for truth and accountability goes on.
It's a long and difficult journey, but it's an essential one for healing and preventing future tragedies.
If you're interested in learning more about this, I encourage you to dig deeper, look into Detective Patricia Jewell's work, research other serial killer cases, or think about the ethical dilemmas of seeking justice for victims, even when the perpetrator is already facing the death penalty.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the disturbing but thought-provoking story of Anthony LaRette. We've been talking about Anthony LaRette, a man who left behind a trail of unimaginable horror across America. His confessions offered a glimpse into his dark actions, but they also left us with so many unanswered questions.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to understand the motivations of the patterns of these serial killers, but there's always a part of it that remains a mystery.
Right, and LaRette's case is a perfect example. We can look at his movements, how he chose his victims, the way the violence escalated, but the biggest question, why, often just hangs there.
It's a question that's both fascinating and frustrating for anyone trying to understand these kinds of criminals.
Yeah, we can speculate, we can look for clues in the evidence, but we might never really know what drove him to commit those horrible acts.
And that's exactly what makes these cases so compelling and so disturbing and also so important to study. They make us face the limits of what we know about human behavior.
They challenge us to accept the fact that evil can exist anywhere, even in places we wouldn't expect.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from LaRette's case that might help us prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, for one thing, it shows us that we need to be constantly vigilant. We need better communication between law enforcement agencies, and we need to develop even more advanced investigative techniques.
That makes sense.
But we also can't forget about addressing the root causes of violence. We need to understand the social, the economic, and the psychological factors that can contribute to creating a predator.
It's a complex problem that needs a complex solution.
Right. We need to invest in research and education, in programs that support vulnerable individuals and communities.
We need to build a culture where people feel safe to speak up, to ask for help, and to challenge the things that lead to violence.
Exactly. We can't just wait for these tragedies to happen. We have to be proactive and create a society where people like LaRette are less likely to emerge a society where darkness is met with light and compassion and a shared desire to stop these things from happening.
It's a huge challenge, but it's something we have to do.
We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to ourselves.
We need to learn from the past and build a future where these horrors are less likely to occur.
By examining these dark parts of human behavior, but trying to understand what creates individuals like Anthony LaRette, we can hope for a world that is a little safer, a little kinder, and a little more just.
That's a powerful thought. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the disturbing but ultimately important story of Anthony LaRette.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.